Hey everybody, I'm back and it's time to talk about the pituitary gland. So if we go over here and take a quick look, for some of you, we've already talked about this in class, but for some of you we have not. So I'm going to assume that we have not talked about this yet in class. Now the pituitary gland is the master gland because he's kind of the big one in charge. He's going to make a lot of hormones that are going to control and regulate other glands and the hormones that are released by them. Now, there are two hormones down here that are actually made by the hypothalamus right here. We talked about those in class last time. Those are made by the hypothalamus, but they are actually stored and released up here by the anterior pituitary. Now, antidiuretic hormone, if you remember, if it's antidiuretic, it's then going to not act as a diuretic. And if you remember, diuretics make you urinate more or lose more water from the kidneys through urine. So if I'm an antidiuretic, that means I'm going to retain water, yeah. So oxytocin, on the other hand, is going to do things like smooth muscle contractions, in particular labor contractions, but it also helps us with milk flow and also with feelings of bonding. So that's just kind of a quick review of those two. Now let's focus in on these hormones up here. We've got 6 main hormones. There actually is a 7th. That 7th hormone is called MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone, and we'll talk a little bit about that one in a minute. So I'm going to kind of jump over here for just a quick second to our Word document. All right. So we've got our pituitary gland, so let's just kind of jot down what those hormones are that are produced by the pituitary. So we've got the anterior pituitary gland, and it is going to produce 7 hormones. So we've got growth hormone. Well, I'm going to have trouble spelling, obviously, when I'm typing in here. We've got prolactin. We've got thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, follicle stimulating hormone, or FISH with no I, and luteinizing hormone as well. And that sound was the sound of my corgi interrupting us. So let's just pause this for a quick second. Okay, I'm back from kicking my corgi out of the room. And the last one is MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, oh, we misspelled this one up here too. That's prolactin. All right, so growth hormone should be pretty obvious what it does. Take a wild guess. Yes, it is going to stimulate growth or cell division, in particular in muscle and bone tissue. So it does stimulate cell division across the body, but in particular muscle and bone, which makes sense because if you think about when you get a big burst of growth hormone during puberty, you get very rapid growth. I think my son grew 5 inches over one summer. So it can have some pretty dramatic effects pretty quickly. Now we talked a little bit before about hyper and hyposecretion. So as you're kind of thinking about these different hormones and we're going through them, you can think about what would happen if we hypersecreted or hyposecreted. So if we hypersecreted growth hormone, what would happen? Right, so you get gigantism. If it's during childhood, you get gigantism. You get a slightly different condition if it happens in adulthood, where you don't get lengthening of the bones, but you get widening of the bones. If we had hyposecretion, then we're going to get dwarfism. Okay. Now you don't have to know every disorder there is for every endocrine gland and hormone by any means, but if I were to give you a situation, you should be able to predict what would happen if I produce too much or too little of something. All right, so moving on to prolactin. Prolactin literally tells you what it does. It is for lactation. So this is going to cause me to stimulate milk production. Now, prolactin is produced in response to a baby latching on. So when a baby latches on, they're going to cause you to release more prolactin and oxytocin, and that prolactin is going to cause you to increase your milk production. The more often that a baby latches on, the more prolactin is released, and therefore the more milk you produce. So if you have twins and you're nursing them twice as much as if you had a single child, then you would make more milk in response. It's literally telling the factory to amp up production. So if I hypersecreted this, what would happen? Right, you'd produce too much milk. So you probably need to pump or something to help alleviate that discomfort. If I hyposecreted prolactin, then I'm not going to make enough milk. Right, so in that case, it's possible you might have to supplement with formula or something, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to reproductive system later on. Now, prolactin and oxytocin are both stimulated by a baby latching on. So thinking back to our last lecture, we talked about the 3 different ways you can stimulate hormones to be released. So you can have hormone stimulation, you can have neural stimulation, or humoral stimulation, which remember is changes in something in the blood, like calcium levels or glucose levels. So if a baby latching on stimulates more prolactin to be produced, then that would be which, do you think? Yeah, that would be neural stimulation. So actually physically stimulating the glands to produce more milk. All right, so if we move on to TSH, TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So therefore it is literally going to stimulate the thyroid to release its own hormones. Now the thyroid makes a variety of hormones, but the ones that are particularly stimulated by TSH are going to be your T3 and T4 hormones, or thyroxine and triiodothyronine. These are going to, hold on just a second here, these are going to increase your metabolism. Now, you remember back to what your metabolism is? So metabolism, if you remember, is when we're including all of the chemical reactions in the body. So that includes breaking things down, building things up. So your body essentially becomes busier at the cellular level. So the more T3 and T4 you have, the busier they are. It's going to have a direct effect on things like ATP production so that you have more energy. All right. Now, that's your TSH. Thyroid is going to cause an increase in T3 and T4, which then increases your metabolism. Now, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is a long one here, so adrenocorticotropic hormone. I'm going to move this over just a little bit here. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal glands. Okay. Now, I want to take a quick side note here, just to talk about the adrenals for a quick second. Your adrenal glands make a whole bunch of hormones. We're going to talk about them in a different talk. But the short answer is that your adrenals help you to deal with stress. So that means they're going to help you deal with immediate stress, emergency situations. That's going to be your fight or flight response. And they're going to help you deal with long-term stress. So imagine that you're recovering from an illness, if you're dealing with the fact that you don't have a stable home environment because maybe your home was just destroyed by a hurricane, or maybe there's just disruption within the family unit. So there can be a lot of things that can cause long-term stress, and you're going to need to be able to deal with that. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the adrenal glands. Now, your adrenals, your fight or flight hormones, we kind of already know those because we know about our neurotransmitters that are released during fight or flight response, your sympathetic neurotransmitters, and those are going to be the epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So those give you your immediate fight or flight, increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, all of that stuff we've talked about with nervous system. The hormones that are actually stimulated to be released by the pituitary, the ACTH, they're going to help me release my corticoids. In particular, those corticoids that help me deal with maintaining glucose balance in the blood. So this is going to increase release of long-term stress hormones by the adrenals. All right, and we'll talk more about that when we actually get to your adrenal glands. So just remember, ACTH, stimulating the adrenals, it's going to help you release corticoids, which are long-term stress hormones. Okay, now FSH and LH I kind of like to lump together because they are both going to stimulate the gonads. So they're both going to have some kind of impact on the ovaries and testes. Now, FSH refers to the follicle that grows around the oocyte when it develops in the ovary. So this is going to stimulate egg production. Just think FSH looks like a fish with no eyes. So when you think of fish eggs. Okay? So it's going to stimulate egg production. Now, this is from your pituitary gland. Males have pituitary glands as well. So what would be the comparable gamete produced in testes, if not eggs? It would be sperm, right? So FSH is going to stimulate both egg and sperm production in the gonads. In addition, it's going to stimulate estrogen production in the ovaries. So it has a little bit of an extra effect on the ovaries. Now LH, this stands for luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone, we see have really big spikes and then it stops. So we get a spike and then it crashes and a spike and it crashes, and that spike happens about every 28 days. So LH is going to stimulate ovulation from the ovaries. That happens about halfway between your menses, or between those menstrual periods in coming from the uterus. So it's going to stimulate ovulation from the ovaries about every 28 days. Obviously that varies from person to person, and again we'll talk more about that when we get to reproductive system. It's also going to stimulate the gonads to produce sex hormones from both the ovaries and testes. So if you look down your hormone list in your course pack, then the ovaries, it's going to trigger production and release of estrogen and progesterone, and the testes, good old testosterone. MSH stands for melanocyte, stimulating hormone. And if you remember, melanocytes do what? They're going to cause you to produce more melanin. So increased production of MSH is going to cause an increased production of melanin or pigment in the skin. All right, we're just about running out of time, so that is your quick summary of hormones produced by the pituitary gland. Okay, so you got growth hormone, stimulating cell division, prolactin, causing milk production, TSH, stimulating the thyroid to release its metabolic hormones, ACTH, helping me deal with long-term stress, FSH, stimulating egg and sperm production by the gonads, and estrogen production from the ovaries, LH, stimulating ovulation from the ovaries, and sex hormone production by the gonads, and then MSH, stimulating melanocyte production of melanin. Okay. Goodbye for now, and I'll be back with another video on more hormones soon. Thank you.